Good morning and welcome to ACT Chess Association stream of their events that are currently being run here in Canberra, Australia, while chess clubs aren't meeting face to face. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association, and I produce these summaries usually the day after the event takes place. The event we're looking at today is the ACTCA August Standard, which is a 6-round event. Which we play 1 round a week at time limit of 45 minutes plus 15 seconds per move. Now you might be wondering why we're running an August event starting in July, but given that the bulk of this event is running across August, I thought I'd go with that name instead. This is the 4th event that we've now run at this time control, and it turns out that it's quite popular with many players here in Canberra who are missing their regular club chess. And last night we had 17 players front up for the first round. Well, I think we had 15 front up, and there's a couple of half-point buys that were requested, but normally we get around about 20 players that take part in this event. And the advantage of 45 minutes plus 15 seconds a move is that you've got time to think about your move. Some people actually have chessboards set up as well so that they can look at the chessboard. Of course, in online chess, touch move doesn't apply, but I'm just curious about whether the people who do use chessboards actually don't touch the pieces, of course, and just analyse in their head like in a normal game. It was the first round, which normally means there's lots of one-sided games, but I was quite impressed that there were a number of quite well-played games by lower-rated players against higher-rated players, including kind of this one. But I'd like to give a shout-out to Cam Cunningham, for example, who pushed his opponent Victor Braggon all the way through, and especially to Paul Dunn, who was playing Graham Saint. Paul dragged himself out of his sick bed to take part in the tournament, and the game was pretty even all the way through. So A, well done to Paul Dunn, and B, I'm glad you're back on your feet in a fashion and playing some chess. But the game I did choose was a game between Tim Pearce and Chris Lyles from the first round, and while it was a win for Tim, the game was reasonably even up until a point when Tim got an advantage. But the reason I'm choosing it also is just to look at the ways that you convert your winning positions essentially into completely won games. So let me just get across. As I said, time limit 45 minutes plus 15 second increment. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3. Could play the Nimzo Indian with bishop g4, but Chris swaps back into the queen's gambit. Declined, and after e takes, which is the exchange variation, Tim plays bishop g5. Now, I've drawn a whole lot of arrows already on this board, just to point out that sometimes, even early in openings, you can always follow a fairly standard middle game plan. And in this case, one of the common plans, especially in the exchange variation, where white captures on d5 with the c-pawn, is that you get something known as the minority attack. And I've mentioned that before. And it's one of these things that A, is quite strong, and B, if you're looking to improve your chess from about 1500 level to 17 or 1800 level, it's one of the things you need to learn. And the idea is that you want to target the pawn on c7 or the c7 square. And sometimes that pawn will go to c6. So essentially what you do is you swing your heavy pieces across to the queen side, including the rook, all the way from h1 to b1, and you push your A pawn and B pawn up the board. And the idea is that you attack the pawn on c6 a few times, and if the pawn captures, then you can run your rook down to c7. And if the pawn doesn't capture, you take on c6. And after B takes c6, the pawn on c6 becomes a weakness. It doesn't really happen in this game, but there is a point where it could have happened, so I'll come back to that. Black played knight b d7. Now, there's a well-known trap in this position, which I thought I'd highlight. I may have shown it before, but if I haven't, and it's just simply knight takes d5 looks like a good move because of the knight being pinned by the bishop. And if you take, you lose your queen, like so. Knight takes, bishop takes queen. That looks pretty good for white, except for bishop b4 check from black. Comes as a surprise, because if you notice now that the king can't get out of check, except by putting the queen in the road. And then after bishop takes, king takes, take the bishop on d8, and if you count the minor pieces, you'll suddenly realize that in return for the pawn that was grabbed on d5, white has managed to lose a piece, and black is easily winning here. Claimed a few victims in their time, but weirdly enough, not as many victims as I thought. So e3 now gets played. And knight takes d5 now is a threat because after bishop b4 check in that line, the king can always run to e2. So you don't have to give up your queen anymore. So bishop b4, pin and win. And white continues with bishop d3, black castles, knight ge2. You could play knight f3, knight c6 and castles as well in this position. Knight g2 is fine. And black has a number of choices here. Rook e8 was played in the game. h6 to kick the bishop around a bit. Even c5 if you want to be nice and aggressive and get some play in the center of the board. You are giving yourself an isolated d-pawn, but at the same time you're getting open files and lots of activity for your pieces. So rook e8, we castle here. And c6. And it's still, there's enough pieces on the board that there are a few flexible plans. After queen c2, knight f8, at first glance I went, oh, that's a bit slow, but I realized that it's dealing with the threat of bishop takes f6, followed by bishop takes h7. So you add another knight to defend h7. There, we play rook ad1, and then as I said, if you play something like knight e6, which looks like an okay move, you suddenly get hit with this move here. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and bishop takes h7. And as much as chess is about putting your pieces on good squares, it's also about tactics. And you've just got to keep calculating those tactics as you go. So queen to d6 instead. Not quite sure about that move, but we'll see. So knight g3. So white is not looking at any queenside minority attacks, as I mentioned at the top of the game, but is shoveling the pieces across to the king side in the hope of maybe launching some. Twice before the bishop and the two rooks have come into the game so much. There is vague ideas of attacking on h2, but it never really works. So bishop hops back here to kick the queen. Queen goes back to d8 with maybe the hope of playing queen h4, a3, and bishop takes c3 might have been better after queen takes. For some reason, Stockfish or whichever engine I was using to analyze this did suggest g5. Don't like it, but it claimed the position was equal after bishop e5, but I just wouldn't trust that move myself. It just weakens the king. So bishop d6, takes. And now white could have actually played a nice move like e4 here. Sometimes you've just got to be aggressive. Even with these slow build-ups, at some point you're going to have to push. And e4 is nice, because after d takes e4, knight c takes e4, hitting the queen. Queen best to retreat, and then you just play rook over. If you take the offered gift of queen takes d4, white has a really good move here. Knight d6, double exclamation mark. And the reason being is that you've uncovered the attack on h7, which in and of itself doesn't work because of the knight protecting, but the rook attacking the queen does. For example, you're now hitting the rook. You are threatening to play bishop takes h7 to win the queen. And if the queen takes the knight, then this is how it rolls out. Takes on h7, knight takes h7, rook takes d6, and white is just easily winning here. Excuse me, rook fe1, and queen goes to h6. Who knows, the opponent may miss the fact that queen takes h2 is threatened, but after h3, the knight just has to retreat. And white is a little bit better. If they'd played e4, that would have been a lot better. Knight f5, on the other hand, wasn't so great. It attacks the queen, but of course bishop takes and bishop takes. And why that helps black more than white was, of course, that knight had been doing a lot of moving around the board, often to good squares, but eventually it got exchanged by a piece that had actually done absolutely nothing during the game. So in a sense, the bishop on c8 could have been utilised earlier. Sitting back is kind of wasting time for black, but white gave them the opportunity just to go, well, this piece isn't doing much, so I'll get it to do a job, which is to swap. As I've said before, you know, sometimes chess is about working out which pieces you should keep and which pieces you should get rid of. So, queen g5 would have been nice here. Bishop back, knight g6. White still has a small edge, but black is a lot better in this position. They've managed to complete their development, connect their rooks, got their pieces onto the king side. So knight h4, looking at the g2 square, is one idea. But instead, e8, heading for c5. Move or d takes e4 was definitely not a great move, as we're about to see in a second. Rook takes e4 probably played here, and up at c5, rook e7. Now, this comes to the point that I'd made right up at this point with all these arrows, was in this position here, White's best plan may be now to go for what's known as the minority attack. And the idea, of course, is that the pawn on c6 at the moment is a little bit of a weakness. Isn't it protected by the pawn on b7? And that's correct. So essentially what you do is you swing your rooks across to the queen side and you look for open files by playing b4, b5 with a rook on b1. And eventually if the pawn takes, the rook can take on b5 and b7 becomes the weakness. Or if you let the pieces swap with something like b takes c6, b takes c6, then the backward pawn on c6 becomes a weakness. While this knight on e5 c5 is very nice. And even if black swings the knight over to exchange on c5, capture with a don't capture with a pawn, otherwise you've suddenly run out of your chances of making open files. You may also ask yourself, and I did learn about these positions, is it easier for white to decide than black to, for example, try the same trick on the backward e pawn here, or not the backward e pawn, but the e pawn? And it's simply because on the queen side, it is easier to get those pawns rolling than it is to play f5, f4, especially because it tends to weaken the as well. So this is why minority attack on this. By the way, first time I think I ever successfully executed a minority attack was years ago at Belconnen Chess Club against Ian Rout. And it happens to be his birthday today. So happy birthday, Ian. I'm not sure if you ever remembered that game, but I thought I'd just throw that piece of trivia in. Anyway, d takes e4 turns out to be worse. Knight c5, the b7 pawn, and you can only defend one of them because the queen on c2 is also piling up on there. So, rook e7 to defend, and then knight takes e4. So white's won a pawn. So far, so good. Not a massively winning position, but having an extra pawn is always good. Queen g6 could have been played just to pin the knight for the moment, inviting f3 or forcing f3. Instead, the queen went to h4, knight goes back to g3, and at this point, black missed the next tactic. Needed to play g6 to stop the knight from going to f5. Played knight e6 instead, and then of course knight f5 landed on the board, and the knight is doing what knights do. We're attacking these two big pieces. So the queen went back to g5, captured on e7, queen takes e7. Now it's worth taking stock at this point. White has a clear advantage. White has got an exchange and an extra pawn. But you've still got to win this game. Now, when you first start playing chess, generally the winning plan that you've been told to play here is swap pieces off to the ending. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work. Over the years, I've managed to muck up a few games using that plan. So sometimes there's better to have alternative plans, including one of the alternative plans simply in this case is you use your extra material to control more squares on the board than your opponent does. And then slowly you push them back and you use either that advantage to win more material, which is one way of doing it, or to force exchanges that suit you rather than suit your opponent. And we'll see both of those, well, we'll see some of those in action in this game. So b4 gets played. And after g6, queen to e4 to pin the knight for the moment. Queen goes back to e8, and d5 is now a very nice move here. Not because we're exchanging the pawns on d5, which we are, but also we're opening the position up for the rooks to get into the game, and the centralized queen is a lot stronger. So this is about controlling more squares than your opponent, and because you've got more pieces or a slightly stronger army, you can pull this one off. So takes, rook takes 5. King here. Now, white could have just swapped here. Not so much again for swapping pieces off as much as after this little exchange, queen takes b7 wins more material. So you're using your extra material to win extra material, if that makes sense. Instead, rook d1's fine, because as I said, the other thing is you want your opponent terms, so an exchange and keeping the d file under control. Queen c6 instead, and there is a pin, so if the rook takes on d8, of course the queen takes on e4. So, and if you try queen e5 to try and get out of that, f6 is the little tactic, and then the queen needs to go back here anyway. So, queen d3 straight away, now threatening definitely to take on d8. So the rook went to e8 to avoid those exchanges. So black is going to try and keep their pieces on the board as much as possible. The more pieces that come off, the less winning chances they have. So rook d6, queen to a4, okay, queen to c3. So notice that the position keeps getting better for white because more squares are under control. King goes to g8, and queen to f6 is a nice idea now. So now the black king is surrounded, and white actually is now starting to look for a mating attack, as we're about to find out. So the queen went to b3, taking on a3 is not great. So rook goes to d7, and the idea here is that we're looking at the f7 square, we're looking at the g7 square for the queen, we're looking at the b7. At the moment, the two black pieces that are mainly defending is the knight on e6 and the rook, which goes to f8. Okay. The other way of defending is something like knight f8. But if knight goes to f8, white has a different way of winning this position, and just as good. Rook d8 looks good. Rook takes d8. Rook takes d8. And if queen takes on a3, you just play queen d7 here. E7. And it looks like you're mating on f8, except black can hang on for a little bit with this check on a1, and after king h2, queen g7. But you just take here on b7. And after f6, swap queens, go rook to the back rank, a8, and you're just going to win the a pawn. And even if the king gets out, once you take on a7, it's pretty easy just to run this pawn up the board with the support of the rook. And so that was one way of winning if the knight had gone to f8. In this case, the rook goes to f8 to directly defend the f pawn, and then rook d6 comes in. And the idea with this one is that we're going to try and take on e6, because if f takes e6, queen g7 is checkmate. At the moment, though, the queen on b3 is guarding the knight, so rook takes straight away fails because of queen takes. So b6 is played. White could have just continued the torture with rook takes a7, but played rook e7 with the idea of now if we take on d6 with the e6 with the d rook, the other rook on e7 is also protecting. So queen b1 went, queen b1 check, king to h2, queen to e4, thinking that the knight is protected, but it doesn't really matter. Rook takes here, okay, and if black plays queen takes, then you just play rook takes, f takes, queen takes e6, check, rook f7, and you've got queen against rook, which is easily winning. But if you wanted to be a real sadist, you could just take on f7, and after king takes f7, win the ending with 2 pawns up. Instead, the game ended with rook takes e6, f takes e6, and the plan of queen g7 mate actually happened, and Tim Pearce won by checkmate. So that was a good game. Generally what happens with players of big rating differences, and there was about a 550 point rating difference here, is that players will play, the game will stay equal, but then suddenly a mistake will land on the board. And often when one mistake happens, then a second mistake follows soon after. And this unfortunately for Chris, took place with the losing the pawn here on move 22, and then dropping the exchange on move 25. So they were very close together, and that tends to happen. But what was also important here was how Tim, with moves like d5 and queen f6, finished the game off. Chose a plan, easy to choose, gain more space, but at the same time, because of the extra material, had a couple of other plans up their sleeve, which they were able to then use if the first plan didn't work. So that was from the ACT Chess Association Standard event, which we run on Thursday nights with a time limit of 45 minutes plus 15 seconds a move. Quite popular. General strength of the field is between about 1,000 and 1,800. And this is the 4th one that we've been running. We also run Blitz on Monday night, which gets a very strong field. Often the Blitz tournament is just about everyone in the players rated above in the tournament is rated above 1,800. And on Wednesday night, we have a rapid event, which is 10 minutes plus 2 seconds a move, 5 rounds on Wednesday nights. And we normally get a good field of players, anywhere between 500 and 2,200 for that one, if you're interested in taking part in those. No news yet on when the clubs will open in Canberra, because the licensed premises are often operating with restricted numbers in their venues, and they would rather have people buying meals, etc., rather than playing chess, even though people that play chess buy meals. But I'll keep you posted on when that's happening. So probably not till sometime next week will I be doing a summary, probably Tuesday morning, unless I throw something in between from the Chess Olympiad, which is also happening online at the moment. So until then, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you later.